Okay, it says it's running.
All right. Yeah, all right, picking me up. These are the schedules for next spring. Just think, a week from now already the days will be getting longer. Yeah. I have all kinds of garden dreams.
What made that noise?
Her phone. I turned my phone off, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of people get sensitive about that.
Very nice. That was very nice.
Yeah. Okay, we're still in the process of looking at typologies, astrological typologies, psychological typologies are what we are looking at now. And next time we'll talk a little bit, that'll be in January, we will look a little bit at mysticism and the concept of typology, though there really isn't a mystical typology. There are some ancient ones like choleric, sanguine, and things like that, but we won't do a lot of that. We're currently looking at the typology of Carl Jung, and we are comparing and contrasting it with astrology and with mysticism. And the reason for doing this is not to have one thing better than another, one thing to be more right than another. It is a matter of each gives something in human understanding that the other does not. And what we're doing is very hard to do, because in the first place, this is meant to be an advanced technique astrology course, and not everybody has that much familiarity with astrology that it is advanced. And it's also difficult because almost nobody knows very much about Carl Jung. I think Hila and I are the only ones that have read much extensively in Carl Jung, and it's way too big to try to introduce astrology and psychology, and so what we're going to do is just talk about some of the ideas and hope you get interested enough to explore for yourself. I looked around to see if I could find a spare Psychology of Types, but I have only my personal copy. Otherwise, if I had another one, I would lend it out so that people could circulate it between them. Now, in the meeting previous to this, we looked at Jung's antinomy of psychological stances. And there are two basic stances that are between the subject and the object. In Jungian psychology, they are called introversion and extroversion. They complement each other, and when they are taken as a whole, they describe a cycle of taking things in and giving things out. We're talking in the mysticism class, we're talking a lot about that cycle, and we have at least another 2 meetings before we have finished that, because it's so basic to our daily life and our relationship to the world that it's important that it be studied. In the mysticism class, we're looking at it as part of a greater cosmology. Now, for an introvert, the subject, that is the self, is what is most important in interactions with the outer world. Not surprising that introvert means somebody who's inward. And because that's the case, appealing to the state of the self is what is important. External objects serve the self, and they serve the subject. And the value of external objects is subjective. I am sometimes extremely introverted in my consciousness and very fixed sign, which is a deadly combination, because I don't value money. I'm very bad with money at all. And then with all that fixed sign stuff, I tend to be arbitrary. I want what I want, and money is no objective, and then I find myself short. Especially now, I find myself short since the tax bill came in this week. Now, this can mean, or this does mean, that for introverts, the view of the cosmos, of the world, is subjective. Now, when people hear the word subjective, they tend to think that that means it's bad. It is not necessarily true, because if a person regards oneself as a truth seeker and tries to find the within that is behind everything, the subjective can be very true. It can be very accurate. Normally when we think of subjectivity, we think of biases and personal biases. Now, a lot of astrologers are introverts, and they do their astrology by understanding other people in what they find in themselves. Now, provided they're not biased, that's really good. Because if you can't understand it and relate to it from your own experience or from things that have taken place in your inner consciousness, it's pretty hard to come to an understanding at all. If an introvert becomes excessively inward, the introvert becomes weakened because it doesn't have any relationship to anything in the world, and it's sort of like somebody that's a monk that's afraid to get out of his cell and have anything to do with the world. When that happens, external objects that the attention of the self is placed on become fearsome. One becomes afraid of the external world. I think all of us have done that to some extent when we're subjective and we're in ourself and we're looking at the world around us. Things look like gigantic tasks that we're never going to overcome. And in our introversion, we make them bigger than they really are. It isn't like we're cringing and cowering in fear of a train or something like that. It's a much more subtle kind of introversion. For the extrovert, the object is the important thing. And the truth is not within, the truth is outside in the object. Obviously, extroverts are outward. The value of everything is without. It's all the facts that really count. The subject applies itself to the objective world, but it's at its best if it lines itself up with the external world. Now, for extroverts, there is a prejudice against subjective behavior. We find that in science all the time, but they'll say, oh, that's subjective, as if subjective is something very bad rather than being very good. Obviously, materialistic science that we have now is very extroversive. The truth is in the world, and all we have to do is measure it and see what's actually taking place, and then we'll know the truth. Materialistic scientists have great disdain for mysticism, and they even have disdain for the psychologies of Freud and Jung because they talk about an inner unconscious. And they find that all just way too subjective, and therefore it has to be untrue. Since they only measure externals, which includes brain waves and things like that, the psychometrics of materialistic psychologists are very weak. the attempts of psychologists to measure, for example, statements from astrologers all fail. They all fail because they have no gradation of, telling whether this is true or that is true in their tests. Their tests are very crude, or like caveman style. There's only a very few things, yes, no, that can be said with objectivity. And there is a failure to understand that outward expressions may have a myriad of internal experiences behind them. There may be a number of reasons why a person is crying. And if you're looking from the without and you're measuring the brain waves and you're seeing a person crying, you say, oh, that person must be sad. Maybe they're tears of joy. They don't have that. They don't have testing for that. So extreme extroverts ignore the within as much as they can. They don't even think about the thought process that they put into in science, for example. When there are emergencies and tragedies, people who have been external fall apart because they haven't established an inner strength to be able to cope with the difficult outer circumstances. Because of this, our society does not have a good understanding of, how would you say it? Understanding of people's emotions and feelings and what their psychology is all about. There was a professor here for many years in the philosophy department. The philosophy department at that time was mostly logical positivists, and they played all those logic word games. And this professor's name was Ammerman. He was a really interesting guy. He used to hang out at the Senate bar downtown. But he was an interesting guy, and he would chide the other philosophers, telling them that they were not in touch with reality. And he said, philosophy is effete. It's not going anywhere. If in order to get something, you have to look at people like Carl Jung, or you have to look at literature, because the psychological understandings are found more in literature than they are found in philosophy, in philosophical understandings that way. Now this brings us now to the next major component of Jung's psychological typology: function. Function is a psychic activity which is always present and constant and in use in the psyche. That is almost word for word Jung's definition of it. One may have the basic functions in various proportions or in various states of development or with various different flavors, but one always has the same basic functions. Functions are something in common with all people in all things. Now, when we say that a human being, in a different sense of the word, has a function, we say that person does something. A function is a means of doing something. A psychic function is a function that one uses within the psyche or within the soul. Now, Carl Jung, like all of the depth psychologists, was a very excellent observer. Very excellent observer. And he came to the conclusion that within the soul of humanity there are 4 functions: sensing, feeling, thinking, and intuiting. As far as I can tell, that's a very good observation. Now, in the meeting previous to this, the typology of socionics, which has more functions than Jungian psychology, was brought up. And I spent a good amount of time in the last 2 weeks looking into socionics. And it is a very good typology. And it is an aptly named psychology because it blends together both psychology and sociology. However, it is not psychological typology as we are looking at psychological typologies. What it is a hybrid. It puts forth 16 types. Now, in the book on psychological types by Jung, only 8 are discussed. There are 8 others that could be discussed, but that would have made a large book even much, much larger. He mentions it in there. If you take into account primary and auxiliary functions, you expand the types to double. And for socionics, there are 16 types, but the 16 types are different. I don't know how to say it because, well, let's just go ahead. The types from socionics are not psychological. They are both psychological and sociological. Psychological functions have to do with how the soul functions. And maybe even why it functions. Something is done, and it differs from socionics in that it talks about the function that does it, not what is done or where it is done. So there's a big difference. If we look at our sheet that we're looking at, the profile index, it's like mixing profile number 4 together with profile number 10. And number 10 is in the kind of profile that is an opportunity profile. It's what the attitudes get applied to. So the attitude profiles are basically psychological, and the house functions or the opportunity profiles are what they are applied to in the external world. Now, I'm not opposed at all to socionics. I think it's a very good way for psychology to be going. It's much better than having a psychological test being completely separate from an aptitude test. You know, like you go to a social worker for an aptitude test, and you go to a psychologist for a psychological test, and they don't speak each other's language. So it's a good thing to have that kind of test, just as long as it's not considered the same as a psychological test in typology. And neither the purely psychological or the psychotronic tests are as elaborate as astrology. If there's one thing that you can bring away from this is how powerful astrology is. It's too powerful for most people because to keep everything in your consciousness, if you want to understand the whole of a human being, the things that you learn through psychology is too much. And especially to have the relative importance of how to keep it all together is too much. Very hard to make good judgments. Now, I suspect that the founder of Socionics was an extrovert. Just a speculation. I suspect that because the things that he adds to the Jungian types, for which it was his starting point, are extra psychic. There's something that goes outside, and that's something that's likely to be the case with an extrovert. Now, these are some interesting tables. They're taken from the Wikipedia page on psychotronics, but they're beefed up. I added a few things to them. Everything on the far right that's outside of the table is something that I added. This is both an extremely good and an extremely bad table. The first four columns, the four columns on the left, are extremely good. And the four columns on the right are very bad. And the last two columns, those on the right, are terrible. And number 7, the type alias, is laughable. I don't know what to say. I don't want to pan something. Whoever wrote this art. Now, the Wikipedia page on socionics is not the best page on socionics. There are several other pages that are much, much better, websites that you can find that are much better to look into if you want to really understand the psychotronics. All right. If you want clarification as to why I think that the column 7 and 8, especially 7, are laughable, I will respond if you have questions about that, but otherwise I would just as soon drop the subject and not bring it up again. If you look at the 4th column, it says MBTI, and that stands for the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, which is a formalization of Jungian typology in an attempt to find types through testing. Unfortunately, Myers-Briggs and Socionics did not read Jung carefully. And even more important, they didn't go through the painstaking observations that Jung went through. Jung spent all day, every day, in mental institutions observing human behavior, and then in private practice. And he was both he and Freud were excellent observers. And that the people who followed after weren't. Now, if Jung had been read carefully, the psyche would be seen as a very live and vital thing, very subtle. And it's not something that should be rigidly pigeonholed, which is what the typologists do. Even Myers-Briggs does that. The problem with typologists is they type people, and that's not favorable for understanding. To name something and describe something is very different from understanding it. And it's very different from appreciating it. You can name something and say, oh, that's that. But are you really appreciating it? I don't know. And all of that is a step away from healing someone or helping them to overcome a problem. Now, I have never taken or graded a socionics or a Myers-Briggs test. I've taken a Myers-Briggs test, but I've never graded one. So I can't speak about that. In fact, I'm checking right now about getting certified to do that test. The unfortunate thing about Myers-Briggs is that it results in a type. What would be much better, which is something I don't know, is if it graded how much of a thinker you are and how much of a feeler you are and how much, so that like if you had like numbers from 1 to 100, that you could see, get a gradated view and you could compare the thinking versus the emotional type, if you want to call them types. That would be so much better, much, much better. The healthiest psychology is always balanced. That's a cornerstone of any psychology, and especially Carl Jung's psychology, is that balance is all important. Now, in a balanced psychology, a person may be a little bit more thoughtful or a little bit more feelingful, but if they're not, as soon as you hear the thought, this is a feeling type person, that's problematic. The most exaggerated inclinations are probably the most pathological. Think just taking the simple introversion, extroversion. An extreme introvert is what you call a schizophrenic withdrawal. They don't have anything to do with the external world at all. And an extreme extroversion is a mania. You're fixed on that thing outside and you're manically that way. Now, when you read The Psychology of Types by Carl Jung, it's fascinating for the observations. You don't have to read the whole book, which is huge. If you go back to about page 350 and read the next 40 pages, that's the best part of the book if you just want to understand the typology. If you get a chance, I imagine you can check them out at the library. I'm pretty sure the university library has them there. I won't loan out a book that I've loaned from a library, so otherwise I could do that because I have privileges at the university. Jung makes very good explanations about what this does to the character. Now, in lieu of such observations and checkable conclusions drawn from those observations, some typologists, to put it gently, theorize. The better word would probably be speculate. It's great fun to speculate and say that so-and-so is so-and-so because of this and that, but it's not science. Speculation can even be beneficial, provided the speculation is used as a means to working into the unknown as a tentative hypothesis. If it is not, it is a recreation at best. And the last two columns in this sheet are speculation. Speculation of a very egregious sort. And from what I read from various places here and there on the net, there's a lot of disagreements between socionics people, and they all accuse each other of being speculators. So it's an interesting thing. All right. Let's get back to comparing Jung's functions to the elements in astrology. Now, when we do this, or attempt to do this, we encounter an enormous problem for spiritual astrologers. if one is an ordinary materialistic astrologer, this is not a problem, because the elements relate only to nature that we see. If one is involved with the mysteries and knows that everything is analogous with everything else, and one of the mystical principles is that everything is in everything, things become very, very complicated. And the only way that you can work through the complication is with intuition, because the intuition puts you in touch with the unity, the spirit that is behind all things, and it can tell you exactly where to focus. Otherwise, you get lost. Now, in the meeting previous to this, 2 weeks ago, or was it 3 weeks ago because of Thanksgiving? I forget. We discussed the elements as part of nature. And we said that that system developed with humans as being an extension of nature. No, that's certainly true. We have no doubt about that at all. But it's not the only way those things can be looked at. And nature that we see around us, with the solids, liquids, gases, and energy, is only part of nature. And astrology applies to things that are not just that simple. Astrology applies on different levels, and it applies in a parallel manner and in an analogous manner. Now, sometimes in the cosmos, we're talking about cosmological astrology now, which is very, very difficult. Some things relate to one level, and some things relate to another level. And unless you know what is what in a horoscope, you can come to some very strange and erroneous conclusions. I'll try to get to this with examples. In nature, we see earth, and we see water, and we see air. We don't see the air, but we know it's there. And we see the effects of fire, and we know what they are. And we know what is meant when we hear those words. However, the elements can also equal the solids, the liquids, the gases, and the energy. Energy used in the way the physics uses the word energy. And that often works well too, even though it isn't the same thing as the direct nature observation. The mystic can see these elements as representative of the physical world for earth, the desire world for water, the world of thought for air, and the transcendent spiritual worlds as fire. Mystics have done that for ages. You see what I'm trying to get at? That if you're looking at it in nature, you're looking at it on one level, and that means something very different on the deep spiritual level. Now, this categorization works pretty well. Not perfectly well, we'll get to it more in a little bit. And it is very helpful for an astrological practice in helping people. There are other parallels as well. A few years ago, when we looked at the physical personality of Helen Keller, we did a little side trip into all of the astrological conditions that lead for deafness and blindness. And we saw that there were quite a few of them, and quite a few of them were in the horoscope of Helen Keller. And we noted at that time that earth, water, air, and fire can relate to each of the four ethers: the chemical ether, the life ether, the light ether, and the reflecting ether. It can very well apply to them. And in the chart of Helen Keller, there was nothing in the air signs, which relate to the light ether, which is most important in terms of perception. We looked at that and says, yes, that looks significant. And that doesn't mean that every horoscope that is without air sign planets is going to be somebody who's going to be weakly perceptive. But if somebody has to work with that in a given incarnation, they might use the astrology in that way to carry out their destiny. So that fits very well also. Now there are other parallels that we could take and go very, very deep into spiritual worlds, but it'd be too much of a distraction. And I don't know if I have the capacity to deal with things that big and that deep anyway. So this is something that mystery students find frustrating and flabbergasting. Being earthy, somewhat materialistic people, because right now what's important is the earth element is all important now, because matter and the way we function in it is very important. We're carrying a little bit overboard, but when there is an earth accentuation, there is a tendency to want to have things neatly compartmentalized. Again, those little boxes or pigeonholes or something like that. And you can't do that, because humans are too subtle, they're too fluent in their real nature to be successful at that. This, again, accentuates the need to develop intuition. Because unless we have intuition and rely on intuition and know how to interpret intuition, you're not going to get very far in astrology. Without intuition, the simplest level of astrology is way too complicated, way too many factors to really keep in mind. I've never run into a mental astrologer that could keep it all together right. All right. If we think about it, the suffering of other people and the desire to help them is a pretty good impelling force for us to work on developing the intuition. It's important. Now, it seems to me that the direct nature way of looking at the elements is way too limited. Yes, we have the case of Bunsen, who invented the Bunsen burner, was an Aries, a flaming fiery sign, and we can find instances of people that relate into the nature force of air and all of the other elements, but there are very few. There are very few. And it doesn't tell us much about their psychology. So it seems safe to discard that interpretation of the elements in comparing it to Carl Jung. And it also seems safe to discard the solids, liquids, gases, and energies, because to follow that would be very materialistic and would be very limiting to a human being, and we know that a human being is much more than that. And even more limiting is the whole idea that the elements relate to the four ethers. They're nice things to know, because sometimes you may need them, but that doesn't, that isn't the best way to look at the elements in terms of the psychological nature of a human being. So this leaves us with what is probably the best comparison with Jungian types, and that is that earth relates to the physical world and the physical body, water relates to the world of emotions and desires and the corresponding desire body, air relates to the world of thought and the mind, and fire relates to the transcendent worlds of spirit. That seems to be the most reasonable to carry out what we're trying to carry out. Now, roughly, this meshes somewhat well with Jungian typology. We remember Jung is only looking at people and talking to them. He's not having the clairvoyant ability to look at their desire bodies and minds and such like that. But he's inferring these things from observations as he sees the higher vehicles manifested, which he calls the soul, in the physical body. And this pretty much agrees with mysticism, which we're going to discuss the next time we meet. Now, what remains is to see more clearly the elements and the types and how they agree and disagree with human nature. We're going to be very, very shallow in this and very fleeting in this because it's way too big. But let's look at Earth versus the sensate type in Carl Jung. And when we compare the earthy element with the sensate type, we immediately see that there are differences. And again, the differences are a matter of understanding psychological function. Functioning is an activity, and a function is a means of activity. An element is a state of being, and a body is also a vehicle relating to that state of being. So we see something on one hand very dynamic, or something that is understood in use, and the other is seen as a state of being. They're two very different things. So when we look at the elements in astrology, we are not looking at the same thing that Jung looks at with his typology. There is a relation, especially if we realize rebirth and the principle of cause and consequence, because what we do is eventually what we're going to become. If we do a lot of thinking, we're going to become a thinking type. There's no doubt about it. And that's what our spiritual anatomy will be like. So let's get an example and try to understand a little better. Sensing is an activity. What is sensed is a state of being. Now, not making distinction between an activity is where socionics got itself into trouble. People have misunderstood Jung's psychology. They try to say there is this type and this type is this. Not that this type does this. In astrology, the earth sign, if there's a strong emphasis, indicates a strong value for matter. This is especially clear with regard to the physical body. Virgo is known for its care about the physical body to the point of hypochondria. And Taurus has the body as its greatest possession. You never talk about illness when there's a strong focus in Taurus, because there's a silent fear underneath the surface, and it's devastating to a strong Taurus focus to do that. Capricorn is keenly aware of limitations, and especially the limitations of the physical body. Capricorn, when it's strong in a horoscope, very rarely oversteps because it appreciates limitation. Now, a sensate individual in Jungian typology is a designation about the soul and how the soul has developed through an emphasis on sensory perception. A sensate type may or may not like matter. An earthy sign person is almost always going to like matter. But the sensate person might still appreciate the sensation of matter, even though it doesn't like it. For example, there's a possibility that you can have a very highly introverted sensate individual, and that person might have a good understanding of what takes place in matter, whether that person relates to it well or not. If you have an extrovert who relates to matter in extreme, you have somebody who's a sensualist, who loves the textures of things, loves the rich colors and things like that. A strong earthy sign individual, by contrast, will always be fascinated by matter. So as you can see, there's differences. Now, in some ways, function and element overlap, and they're in curious ways. By seeing organization in nature through perception, the soul itself becomes organized. If you have an environment, even your personal environment, that's very well organized and everything is in its right place, that reflects into the soul and it strengthens the tendency to organize. In terms of evolution, the senses themselves are built on the external world. The eye has evolved to relate to light and such like that. Now, earth sign people like to organize. It's something they can focus on, something they can do. Earth sign people will intentionally develop the senses to have an advantage in the material world. So you can see motive in this. By putting together the Jungian type and the astrology, you can see a motivation, and you can, what I'm trying to say here is why we're even doing this class. Because we see from psychology and astrology, we get two different views of things, and each one rounds out the understanding of the character more. All of this notwithstanding, it's probably not a wise idea to become attached to matter. So, from this very brief comparison, we can see how obvious it is that psychology and astrology complement each other, supplement each other, and improve each other. And it shows us good reason to try to study both. Now, if we look at the feeling function in Jungian typology and relate it to the water element, we have the closest agreement between the two systems. Both water and the feeling types value feelings and emotions above all else. Both indicate moodiness, both indicate excitability, and both indicate all the colors of emotion. The rest of the functions are ignored or suppressed when they disrupt or distract or otherwise interfere with feeling. If I'm not feeling, I'm not existing. This is true with accentuated water signs. This is true with accentuated feeling types. In astrology, there is more emphasis on water in nature, while this isn't even mentioned in Jung. Thus, a highly water sign person might incline toward biology or nature studies, and if the support of life that is associated with water, because everything that lives must have water, it brings into things like nurture and alimentation and things of that nature. That's something that astrology with the water element does that Jungian typology does not. On the other hand, Jung finds more subjectivism, even with extroverted feeling. So there are differences, and again, the differences are beneficial. Again, from psychology, we find more emphasis on function, on how things are done, and less of what is done. While in astrology, there's an emphasis on both, but definitely a little more on what is done. Also, again, there's more emphasis on observation in psychology, and more emphasis on intuition and memory in astrology. To practice both, you're doing something different. If you're doing it by observation, you have the person in front of you, and memory isn't such an important thing as when you're making an observation of something that's right there. There's another clear distinction that Jung found in the feeling function, was that it's more likely to be strong or stronger in women. Astrology does teach that the horoscopes of female rebirth should be viewed differently from those who are reborn into male bodies. However, in astrology, it's usually limited to the interpretation of the moon and Venus for the feminine characteristics and Mars and the sun for the masculine characteristics. The negative signs, water and earth, are called feminine in that they are more receptive in nature, where the positive signs are more active and more projective. I know of no study that has ever been made in astrology to indicate that female rebirths are more likely to be more feelingful with the same horoscope. I have encountered some statements from astrologers. At one time there was a famous astrologer, I couldn't believe it, said that in a male's chart, if there are many planets in feminine signs, that means they're going to be a homosexual. And I couldn't believe that somebody would make a statement that specious, but that's, doesn't square with observation, and it doesn't square with the fact that if there are a large number of planets in feminine signs for a number of weeks, that would mean that there would be a whole batch of homosexual people males born in that time, and that's just not the case. That's another one of those cases where astrologers speculate at a very poor time. All right, in all of this, it's clear that if we study astrology, we can't rely on traditional astrology and keeping traditional astrology the way it is. Less emphasis in astrology should be placed on readings and on authoritative statements, and more should be placed on observation and shared study of the horoscope and the life. Now, it's very difficult to compare Jungian typology with the elements, because as you go up through the elements, the divergence becomes very great after the water signs. The air element in astrology is used in simple intellectual comparison. Normally, Gemini contrasts things, and Libra compares things, and Aquarius sees things in whole. Now, for the most part, those are inductive activities. Well, there's some deduction in all of those signs, but we can see that's about as far as we can go with the air signs relative to the thinking function in Jungian typology. Jungian typology is interested in personality, and it looks at the subjectivity of the thinking process. In thinking, you're always alone. You can think back and forth with somebody, but in actually thinking out and creating a thought, you're always alone. Very subjective. Different than the feeling. I've been in a movie theater when something happened in the movie that was tremendously emotional, and a whole wave of feelings sweeps through the audience, and the whole audience feels that same feeling. So that's not so subjective. That's more of a shared activity. So we can see here that Jung is very right in talking about the subjectivity of the thinking process. It's inward, even when it's directed to outer things, as it would be in an extroversive thinker. Now, this is not a consideration in astrology. In the first place, thinking in astrology is not ruled by the airy signs. Intellectual attitudes are, but not thinking itself. The thinking is related to Mercury, Jupiter, and the moon, not by the elements. So if we look at those planets, we could study the adjustments of subjectivity in the thinking process and relate it to character, but that's rarely done. Very few people get that deep about things. Astrology is good for indicating impersonal attitudes like humanism and things like that we find in the air signs. One can delve a little into the accommodations in the psyche, and it's helpful when it's done, but not a lot of that is done. You can take an example, relating to the inclination toward thinking versus the thinking itself. Marilyn Monroe was a Gemini, and she aspired to be a thinker even though she didn't have all the goods. But then there was complementation, because Einstein was a thinker and he needed Marilyn Monroe, but that's neither here nor there. Did they actually really have a tryst?
Who?
Einstein and Marilyn Monroe.
Possibly. Certainly he was very romantic.
With her, yeah, about her.
With other women too.
Yeah.
No, he was an amorous man.
Well, she,
He was.
yeah, she did have a remarkable meeting with Itzhak Dinesen. What was her pen name?
The writer.
Isaac Innocent?
Yeah,
Isaac Innocent.
yeah. They met with a common friend in a restaurant, and by the time the meeting was over, the two of them, Itzhak Dinesen and Marilyn Monroe, were dancing on a table.
She had a thing about Harry Truman too.
Marilyn Monroe did?
She met him and she said he was the sexiest man she ever stood next to.
Wow.
She liked power.
Okay.
He was president of the United States.
Yeah.
Harry doesn't look like a sexy man. but sometimes, well, Einstein doesn't either.
Yeah, he was the last president that really was dedicated, and not the financial aspect of him in the presidency was so minor that when he left office, he had to borrow money to get back home to Missouri.
He and one other president, and I don't remember who the other. He's one of the few presidents that took they get $200,000 a year, that's his
Yeah.
salary.
Yeah.
Most of them don't take it because they don't need it.
Yeah.
He did because he didn't have any money.
Yeah, yeah. Have you been following the Jimmy Carter business?
He's sick.
First having brain cancer and now it's gone.
Oh,
Yeah, melanoma, because melanoma is a strange one in that way. You've had that, right? It comes and goes and you can make it go. All right, but we're very far away from it all. Obviously, you can see that this class is not an exposition of typology. And we're not intending to make an exposition of typologies. The astrological exposition of the elements we'll do later, and it's done in other courses. And what we're trying to do is understand what you can get at in human character by psychology and astrology. We want to see the differences in, if we know what the differences are, we know that we can use this to get this and this to get that. That's what we're trying to do, and this is very hard to do because there's not a lot of familiarity with anybody in what we're talking about. All right. If there is a divergence between the air element and thinking, there is an even greater divergence between intuition and fire. It's so wide that I don't think it even exists. Intuition in astrology is not found in fire signs. It's found in Uranus and Neptune. And there are two different types of intuition, which is something that Jung doesn't even consider at all. By the way, I think, well, I don't want to go into that. We'll get a chance later on. None of the elements is more important than any of the others, even though it seems like that sometimes, especially when we're broke. The earth element seems to be very important. As Jerry and I have just been comparing notes, the tax bills came in and they're astronomical this year. No, none of the signs then none of them are more intuitive than others. You could say a little bit toward Uranus and Neptune, but the differences in intuitive ability derived just from the signs alone is not significant from the planets. Now, following the correspondence that we're trying to follow between Jungian typology and astrology, I tired you out already, huh?
I got to get
Oh, okay. I'll try to be in touch and we'll have tea together with Laura.
Okay.
Good.
Appreciate it.
Good night. So in the way we're looking at the elements, earth relates to the physical world, water to the desire world, air to the world of thought, and fire to transcendent spirit. That breaks down because fire signs are not more spiritual than any other signs. It works well in cosmology, but it doesn't work in astrology. One can say that fire signs are more spirited, and the definition in the dictionary is that spirit is a motive force, but you can't say that they're more spiritual. So what we're talking about here is a parallel correspondence deviates, and even the astrology in the analogous application that we're using doesn't hold true. The word intuition means teaching from within. It is a communication from the transcendent spirit within, and it is spiritual. Jung almost never speaks about spiritual things. He prefers to speak only about psychological things. He did wonder in an appreciative way when he's up in his 80s about things like that, but he never made any serious proclamations. He had his reasons for that, and they were relative to what he was trying to accomplish. And he had to work through his own psychology, which was not suited for doing that. Now, Jung did not see intuition, did see intuition as a psychological function. He did not say where it came from or exactly what it was. And he was honest. He was very honest in doing that. You can talk about intuition and see how it functions in the world without knowing where it comes from. His statements about how it works are very excellent. Again, read that book on types, it's excellent. And again, with Jung, it's a matter of observation. He was a very keen and accurate observer. And again, it would benefit us as astrologers to do the same. Now, we're going to have a lot more to say about the astrological part of all of this when we fill out the profile index. In the meantime, I have these review sheets. They're taken from another course, and there's something for you over the break to be thinking about or to be studying. Useful. We'll be applying them later on. And we're going to be using them when we come to profiling, astrological profiling. Now, there's one thing to note in this where astrology is different than Jungian typology. In Jungian typology, some things are not possible. For example, if you look at this chart, there are the rational functions, thinking and feeling, and the irrational functions, thinking or intuitive. In Jungian typology, you cannot have your primary and auxiliary function be both in either the rational or in the irrational. If both were in the irrational, you would have the subject intuiting and the object sensed, but there would be nothing in between in the soul to relate the subject to the object. If you had the primary and auxiliary function both in rational functions, you would have thinking and feeling, but you would have no subject and no object. It would be sort of like a thinking machine that there was no subject there. So in astrological typology, you see that things are very, very different. You can mix anything with anything else. The final page in the handout where you start getting into element atmospheres is very interesting, and it's, for the last few weeks we've been going through a very Neptunian kind of weather, unusual and foggy and all of that sort of thing. All right, that's as far as we're going to go for tonight, and you have the schedules, and after the next meeting, things become very astrological, and they stay that way for quite a while. Are there any questions? Any objections?
Are these for other classes, or are these for us to study on our own after this?
You can study on your own.
Okay.
We'll take some parts out of there when we start doing the applying.
Are planetary aspects, can you categorize those?
Yes, they're going to be down, they're way down the list of the profile index. They're called the activity profiles. Yes, this is what I'm saying, that astrology is so much more powerful than psychology. No question about it.
So much more,
What?
it has so many more details. It has so many
Details.
more details.
Yes, yes,
Complex.
Currents.
yes.
Refined.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but the detail that Jung comes through from observation, wow. I think that section in Astrology of Types, I think it begins around page 354, Psychology of Types. I'm sorry I don't have a copy of it. I'm not going to buy another one.
I'm sure I have.
I'm not going to buy another. It's a $75 book.
But there are, I think I have a section where there's just his.
Oh, there is a section like that. I even thought of Xeroxing and making a, yeah.
Yeah, because the main part is not very big.
Well, thank you very much.
I have one with, on
Yeah.
this last page,
Yes.
we're talking about element pairs or stressed element trios. Is that like, I haven't read through it yet, but is that like in the context of one personality or like
Yes.
interactions? It's
Yeah.
in a personality, but.
When we get to the index, we'll find some people that have a lot of fire and water, for example,
Right.
and that's called an accentuated pair.
Or stressed elements, like because there's tension or.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
When you were in Oceanside, Richard, you met Manny and Ruth Winokur.